So I'll be reading out of Genesis chapter 20, verses 1 through 18. The scriptures read, "From there Abraham traveled to the region of the Negev and settled down Kadesh and Shur. While he was staying in Gerar, Abraham said about his wife Sarah, 'She is my sister.' So King Abimelech of Gerar had Sarah brought to him. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, 'You are about to die because of the woman you have taken, for she is a married woman.' Now Abimelech had not approached her, so he said, 'Lord, would you destroy a nation even though it is innocent? Didn't he himself say to me, "She is my sister"? And she herself said, "He is my brother." I did this with a clear conscience and clean hands.' Then God said to him in the dream, 'Yes, I know that you did this with a clear conscience. I have also kept you from sinning against me. Therefore I have not let you touch her. Now return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you and you will live. But if you do not return her, know that you will certainly die, you and all who are yours.' Early in the morning, Abimelech got up, called all his servants together, and personally told them all these things. And the men were terrified. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, 'What have you done to us? How did I sin against you that you have brought such enormous guilt on me and on my kingdom? You have done things to me that should never be done.' Abimelech also asked Abraham, 'What made you do this?' Abraham replied, 'I thought there is absolutely no fear of God in this place. They will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. So when God had me wander from my father's house, I said to her, "Show your loyalty to me wherever we go and say about me, he's my brother." Then Abimelech took flocks and herds and male and female slaves, gave them to Abraham, and returned his wife Sarah to him. Abimelech said, "Look, my land is before you. Settle wherever you want." And he said to Sarah, "Look, I am giving your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is a verification of your honor to all who are with you. You are fully vindicated." Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his female slaves so that they could bear children. For the Lord had completely closed all the wombs in Abimelech's household on account of Sarah, Abraham's wife. This is the word of the Lord.
The task of breaking a bad habit is like uprooting a powerful oak within us. And the task of building a good habit is like cultivating a delicate flower one day at a time. This is a quote from a book called Atomic Habits by a guy named James Clear. I feel like it's popular right now. Sometime last year, I bought the book. Never finished it, obviously. Probably tells you a little bit about my reading habits. That's fairly typical. If you've lived any length of time, you have probably attempted somewhere along the line to break a bad habit. And if you're like me at all, you've probably also miserably failed numerous times. Now, if we're talking about breaking a bad habit, maybe like biting your nails or smacking when you chew your food, which my wife points out that myself and our kids all have that habit. The consequences of failing breaking that habit is probably nothing more than continuing to annoy your family members, right? But what about when it's something more destructive? What about cycles of sin that have consequences not only for you, but for those you love? Popular media has explored the idea of the vice of sin through shows and movies like the series called Breaking Bad. That's a pretty popular one, at least from a while back. And the point of these stories attempt to show how certain vices, even when they begin in ways that seem small or even justified, they can take over one's life and family and leave chaos in its wake. Popular media is not the only thing that is honest about the depravity of the human heart. The scriptures also are. It talks about the persuasive nature of sin and the destruction that it can cause, especially when it becomes a pattern and a cycle in one's life. The text you just heard read today from Genesis 20, it records Abraham continuing a pattern of deception and again placing others in harm, hurting them. And so some questions we ask are, how will God respond when his chosen people continue in patterns of sin and failure? Will he just give them some new helpful suggestions to break their bad habits? Maybe he can give up on them and start over fresh. Will he ignore the harm that their sin has caused to the innocent in the story? Or will God be faithful to intervene and act, protecting both his promises and his people to the very end? So these are some of the questions we're going to sit with during our time together in Genesis 20 this morning. Good morning again. As I said, my name is Joel, and I'm excited to just be a part of what God is doing here, serving as one of the elders here at New Eden. As you've already seen and heard, we are continuing in our series through Genesis. We're in chapter 20, covering the whole thing. You heard the entire text thread, so I'm not really going to point out a lot of the verses, but I will highlight some of them. Feel free to follow along if you think that would be helpful. Let me give you kind of a quick roadmap for what today's sermon will be like. I'm going to start by giving a little bit of review for context and giving a quick summary of the text and give you the reasons why does this story exist in the whole broader narrative of Genesis. And then what we're going to do for the bulk of our time is zoom in and look at three primary characters in the story. Abraham first, and then we'll look at Abimelech. And then lastly, we'll look at the main character of the entire book of Genesis, which is God himself. Okay, so quick review. In the Genesis narrative, we've been spending some time with Abraham, started in chapter 12. He's the one through whom God has promised to bless the entire world. So we're following Abraham and his household. Last week, we saw the story of Abraham's nephew Lot get rescued out of Sodom and the unjust lands of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so our story this week is taking place not long right after this ended. So within the next few months, okay? Our story today from Genesis 20, and this is important to know for this week and next week, it finds itself right before the fulfillment of God's promise to Sarah and Abraham that they will have a son. Okay, we've been tracking that promise all the way back in Genesis chapter 12, many years before. This is actually a parallel story. Right after the promise in Genesis 12, there was a parallel story of Abraham's deception, and this story takes place right before the fulfillment of the promise in Genesis 12. There's actually some really masterful literary stuff going on. I might point out some of that next week, but it's a really, really cool thing. So on a cursory reading, today's story is fairly simple. Quick summary, pretty straightforward. Abraham is sojourning through the land. He comes to a place called Gerar, and he interacts with King Abimelech. Abraham is deceptive and says, hey, Sarah's just my sister, not my wife, because he's scared of what might happen, that he might be killed. And so unknowingly, the king takes her into his harem, most likely as his wife, which puts the king and the entire nation in danger, as God reveals to Abimelech in a dream. So God intervenes, protects both Abraham and Sarah by closing the wombs, is the way the text says it, closing the wombs of all those in the land. By the end, Abimelech, restores the dignity of Sarah by giving Abraham flocks, money, and land. And the story ends with God opening back the wombs through the prophet Abraham's prayer. So that's kind of how the story ends. The story is serving a few purposes in the broader narrative. First, for the people of Israel, if they were reading this years later, it's given us an origin story for the Philistine people. They would have conflict with the Philistines down through the years, and this is really where we begin to hear their origin story. Secondly, it's intentionally right before we read about Sarah getting pregnant with the promised child, Isaac. The text wants to make sure we know that no funny business has happened and that Isaac is actually Abraham's son and not someone else, because this was a pattern. So even though Abraham has a pattern of this, the text wants to be clear that the promised seed does come through Abraham and Sarah, just like God promised. And this leads us to the last and main reason this story exists in the large narrative of Scripture. I don't really have points today, but this is like my one big theme or point. Through cycles of human failure, God is faithful to protect both his promises and his people. That is the theme for today. Through cycles of human failure, God is faithful to protect both his promises and his people. So that's kind of some groundwork. Now let's spend some time zooming into the characters of the story, starting with Abraham. So the last couple of weeks, we have seen the character of Abraham presented in a pretty positive light. He's hosted divine beings, gave them a great meal. He has petitioned and interceded on behalf of entire nations very unselfishly. But here in this text, it's very clear we see Abraham's failure. And the text does not sugarcoat his cycle of sin. As he did back in Genesis 12, he is operating in deceit out of fear and doubt, and he even puts his own wife in danger to ensure his own security and benefit. This is coming right after the story where we saw Lot throw some of his own family members out for his own preservation. And here now we see Abraham doing the same thing. We're also told this isn't just an occasional slip up. In verse 13, Abraham himself admits that this is just how we operate. It's an ongoing pattern. So we saw it back in Genesis 12 and now in Genesis 20, but he says, we've been doing this all along. Like, this is just our custom. When I'm scared, I throw my wife out and kind of pimp her out to have my own security. And that's what happens. He's gotten so comfortable with this sin of deception. It's just how I operate. And so we see his cycle of sin, but we also see the confusion of Abraham's sin. Like any of us, when Abram gets caught up in this cycle of sin, it causes him to have a twisted worldview. He begins to operate with the logic of earthly wisdom instead of trusting God and his ways. We see this, the text, the scriptures introduced this idea back in Genesis 3. If you remember, Adam and Eve took fruit and we're told that it was pleasing to the eyes. And so this language is the idea that according to one's own logic and own wisdom, we take what seems good to us. That's the phrase, pleasing to the eyes. It's the same exact phrase used in Genesis 13 when Lot looked out and chose Sodom. It was pleasing to his eyes. And here in our text today, in verse 15, Abimelech offers Abraham to settle in the land. The CSB says it, wherever you want. The literal Hebrew translation there is wherever is pleasing to your eyes. The one who was called to lead his family just last chapter in righteousness and justice. He's going to lead his children in the way. Here he has traded godly wisdom for his own, and this sin of deception has tainted his eyes. We also see his tainted vision in the way he clearly has wrong assumptions about the people of Gerar and King Abimelech. He assumes they have no fear of God. We're really good about this, assume somebody, things about people. He assumes they have no fear of God. And so he makes decisions with that assumption in mind. Now, the irony is that as soon as Abimelech shares this predicament with all of his household, we're told they're terrified, which the text is just saying they had a proper reverence and awe when you come face to face with Yahweh for the first time. And Abraham's the one who's actually operating out of fear of man and doesn't fear God in this story. It's just funny. Sin has confused him, totally twisted things, caused him to operate from his own logic, to assume wrongly about others, and it also causes him to blame shift. He's confronted with his sin by Abimelech in verse 13, and you know what he says? Well, when God made me wonder, it's God's fault. God made me wonder, and so this is how I begin to operate. Again, hearken us back to the garden when that's what sin does. We just blame shift, and then we're further deceived not only ourselves, but those around us. Abraham defends himself. Well, Sarah's my half-sister, which culturally, that wouldn't have been as weird as we hear in our culture, but it's a half lie. It's a half truth, just like the serpent shared in the garden, right? And so this cycle of Abraham's sin has led to confusion. The consequences are devastating. By his deception and lack of trust in God's promise, he's put the whole nation of Gerar in danger, right? Again, some literary things going on here. Last week, Abraham was unselfishly pleading with God for a whole nation to be forgiven. And now we see him selfishly putting a whole nation on the brink of destruction. So he's endangering nations, but not only that, he's putting those he loves in great danger. He has used Sarah as a pawn for his own purposes before, but here it's doubly dangerous. Like just recently, like within a span of a few months, God has specifically said that Sarah would give birth within a year to the promised seed. So not only is Abraham his sin is putting Sarah in jeopardy, it's also jeopardizing the promise of God. As a part of Abimelech's harem, she would have been expected to have sexual relations with him. So by his ongoing sin, Abraham has hurt those around him. He's jeopardized God's promises. He clearly is not shown in a good light in this story. And just like the first time Abraham was deceitful toward Pharaoh in Egypt, he is the opposite of what God called him to be. Remember, he's supposed to bring life and blessing to nations. And here, instead, he brings about death. There's the closing of the wombs, and there's a cursing as a result of his sin. And poor Abimelech is caught up in the mess. So we've seen Abraham. Now let's look closer at Abimelech. He's the king of Gerar. Again, this is the origin story of the nation of the Philistines. So looking back on it, Israel would have assumed this was going to be a bad guy in the story. But the text is set to surprise us. He is actually presented as an innocent victim. God appears to him in a dream to confront him. And he defends himself by saying, look, I've got a clear conscience and clean hands. In the ancient Near East, taking multiple wives was often done for political reasons, and probably what's going on here. Abraham, we know he's a great man. He's got a lot of things. And so Abimelech just sees this as a strategy politically. But adultery, we have it was still like the unpardonable sin, even in like secular cultures in the ancient Near East. Adultery was greatly frowned upon. And Abimelech expresses that through the lens of my moral compass, as far as I know, I'm innocent in this matter. The literal wording here is that I've got clean hands and a pure heart. That's the literal translation. And God even agrees with him in his dream. He's like, yeah, you do. God didn't let him approach Sarah or have sexual relations. And he warns Abimelech further. He says, don't touch her or else you'll die. Same language as the garden. And here, unlike Adam and Eve, Abimelech actually obeys God. He doesn't touch Sarah. And so this is also in contrast with last week's story. If you remember, God sends angels to investigate Sodom, and the case against them was airtight. Here, God comes down to investigate Abimelech, and he finds innocence. So he's presented as an innocent victim in the story, but he also becomes an unlikely witness. Abraham's the one who's supposed to be a light to the nations, share about this great Yahweh and how if we submit to his rule and reign, flourishing can happen. But instead, one of the people who Abraham's descendants would come to know as God's supposed enemies, the Philistines, Abimelech, he becomes the one who shares what God is doing. And he actually spreads the awe of God among his people. He calls everyone together. He's very honest and transparent. I mean, he could have been embarrassed about this, that he was fooled, that he was tricked. He's very honest, transparent, and there is an appropriate response of reverence toward the God of Israel. Not only that, there's a lot of irony in this story. Abimelech becomes the one who boldly confronts Abraham with this sin, even though God called Abraham the prophet. Like Abraham's the scared, deceptive one. I'm like, prophet? He doesn't really seem to be acting that way in this story. Abimelech is the one who acts more like the faithful prophet. And so the story continues to surprise us. Abimelech is so sincere and serious about what has happened that in verses 14 to 16, he actually gives Abraham a bunch of stuff to restore the situation, even though Abraham is the one at fault, right? Like when I'm reading this story, I'm thinking, I think this is like reversed. Like Abraham should be like, yo, I'm sorry. Abraham doesn't really apologize. He defends. But what's going on here is Abimelech is clearly acting as the remover of shame in this story. And the story, the text itself tells us that's the point. All of the gifts, the flocks, the money, and the land, they're not about paying Abraham back. They all have to do with restoring dignity, mainly to Sarah. You see it when he tells Sarah that her honor is verified and that she has been fully vindicated. That is in verse 16 where he says that. The literal language is that all who look on Sarah will have a covering on their eyes. It's this idea that they can't see that she had done anything wrong. So at great cost to himself, this king is removing the shame of Sarah and even Abraham, though they didn't deserve it. So there's a clear contrast to Abraham, and Abimelech is presented in a positive light. He's the innocent king, an unlikely witness, the remover of shame, but still, it is clear that he is dependent on Abraham to pray for he and his people to open back up the wombs that had been closed. He must be a receiver of life by grace alone. He's not powerful enough to reopen wombs and bring new life. The language of the closing of wombs that had happened in this culture that's used pretty broadly, we typically assume that's infertility, but it could refer to something like sexual dysfunction. And this makes sense in the context because this was a very short span timeline-wise. We're also told that Abimelech needed to be healed as well. And so it needed to be something that they knew there was infertility taking place immediately. And so the flawed prophet, Abraham, prays for Abimelech's household, And God answers the prayer of Abraham, brings about life, restores whatever was preventing new life from happening in the Abimelech household. And so if you think about all this, and like Tim Mackey from the Bible Project says, this is worth a cup of tea and a long walk, or a cup of coffee if you're, like me and rather have coffee than tea. Just ponder. And if you meditate on this, it kind of seems weird. Like, why would the one who is presented as morally inept in the story need to intercede for those who seem to be innocent? And even God affirms they are in relation to this story. And this calls us to look beyond what maybe just the eye can see on a cursory reading. Because remember, ultimately, this story and all the stories in Genesis and the entire Bible are not meant simply to teach us about Abimelech and Abraham and say, hey, here's some good moral lessons. It is meant to teach us about the main character of it all, and that is God himself. And so let's look at this last character of our story. See, one thing that is consistent throughout this story is the faithfulness of God to protect both his promises and his people. We're told in verse 18 that because God is moving on account of Sarah, he closes the wombs of an entire nation. The promised seed must come through Sarah, and God will see to it that this takes place, and he will work big picture. Like, he is transcendent. He will work among kings and nations to do so. Proverbs 21 says a king's heart is like channeled water. That is not Proverbs 21. That is my fault. But go ahead. Yeah, take it off. Something about discipline. I'll read it. Here we go. A king's heart is like channeled water in the Lord's hand. He directs it wherever he chooses. God is transcendent and powerful. He works out his plans and his purposes even when our actions jeopardize them. But here's the thing. God is not just this transcendent God that is distant, moving things behind a curtain. He is also immanent, the immanence of God, which means that he is active and involved intimately and personally. His plans are not just carried out like a chess master just simply making his next move. Humans use other humans like pawns, but God does not. He cares for the unlikely ones in this story. Abimelech and his people, these foreigners, these outsiders, these unexpected ones. And we're told in verse 6 that it is God who kept Abimelech from sinning, and it is God who opens the wombs to bring new life. He might have used Abraham's prayer, but make no mistake, it is God who is the one who is opening the wombs. He also cares for Sarah. He protects her, even as her own husband uses her in his deceptive schemes. And through it all, this is the surprising thing, somehow he still stays committed to Abraham as the chosen one. This rebellious prophet, reminding us of Jonah, who reluctantly goes and pleads salvation. Here, in spite of Abraham, he is used to intercede and open the wombs of an entire nation. And the irony is he doesn't even trust that God can open the womb of his own wife. And through this, we learn that God is still involved, even when our sin has created a massive mess. And what a mess that this sin has caused in this story. I think many of us can relate to this. I relate to Abraham a lot. I can often be full of faith and sincerity as I trust God to work and move. Man, this is what he's doing. Let's go. I can commune with him, having sweet moments of communion, having great faith, and then turn around and fall right back into cycles of sin that bring about devastating consequences that confuse me. Maybe you can relate. It will hurt us. It will hurt those we love. And even those maybe we don't even know that well, that we just come into contact with. And when we're confronted with it, if you're like me, we often respond like Abraham. Blame shifting, I'm really good at that one. There's always a reason. Finding reasons to justify my actions, not taking responsibility for the hurt that I've caused. And in these moments, we often struggle to believe that God can still work and move when we fall into the same old patterns. As the old saints called it, a besetting sin. See, we might believe that God gives fresh starts and blank slates. Like, we get that. He'll give us a do-over and let us try again. But what about when we're committing the same old sins over and over and over? Will God give up on us? It's like when my kids want to come borrow some of my computer paper that I'm supposed to be using for my job, and they want to get more and more and more. At some point, I'm like, that's enough. You've messed up over and over, fine. At this point, you don't get any more. Is that how God treats us? Will he give up on us? And here's another question. How will he act toward those we've hurt along the way? Will God forget about them? Have we done too much damage? I've had the privilege of having older saints in my life share, sometimes with regret and sometimes with hope, about their own mistakes they've made in their journey of parenting and raising their kids, thinking, I did the best that I could, but I made mistakes here and there. And I look at my own life and I say jokingly sometimes, like after an interaction with my kids, like, that's gonna be a therapy bill in 20 years. Like, gosh, I am so hopeless. And I say that jokingly, but like, honestly, I'm like, God, I need you. Like, I mean, when I'm here again, apologizing to my kids again for losing my temper, or apologizing to my wife for whatever, it's just like, oh my gosh, this is hopeless. What the heck? Here we are again. There's no way that God is not frustrated. And maybe we are like Abimelech and Sarah. Sometimes we're the ones caught up in the tangled web of sin that others have weaved. Does God see us in those moments? Our passage clearly presents the inadequacy of humans to solve and redeem the mess. The innocent king in our story, Abimelech, he is still unable to fix the problem Abraham created. All the resources in the world still can't bring about life. And the prophet priest Abraham, the one who interceded for Sodom, last chapter prays for Abimelech here. He's revealed to be incredibly flawed, caught up in sin's grasp. He's fixing a problem that he created. We need a better king. One with more than just some physical resources to temporarily kind of cover the shame of sin like Abimelech did with Sarah, but actually remove it completely. We need a better prophet. One who can do more than just declare God's law and confront sin, but actually write God's law in our hearts and give us eyes where all we see are God's ways that are pleasing to us. We need a better priest, an interceder who can not only pray for physical life, but actually bring new and everlasting life. We need one who actually has clean hands and a pure heart. Not just in one story, but in every single instance, because that is the only one who can stand before God. Psalm 24 explores this idea. It uses the same exact language from our passage today that referred to Abimelech. Look at what it asks. Who may ascend the mountain of the Lord? Who may stand in his holy place? Who may be in his presence? Only the one who has clean hands and a pure heart, who has not appealed to what is false. Do you see the imagery it's drawing on from the Abraham story here? Who has not sworn deceitfully. That's Abimelech in this story. He will receive blessing from the Lord and righteousness from the God of his salvation. In this story, Abraham, though flawed, is the one giving blessing, sharing the righteousness and salvation and from the destruction. Do you see the connections? Who can stand before God? Only one who's truly clean, who hasn't engaged in deceit. And as always, we need a better Abimelech and a better Abraham. One who doesn't just bring new habits, but instead a whole new heart. And that's who Jesus is. With this incarnation, he lives the perfect life. He has clean hands and a pure heart. He's not only ascending to the mountain of the Lord, but literally living in his presence, face to face with the Father from eternity past. And since there is no earthly human, our text teaches us this. There's no earthly human who has clean hands and a pure heart who can ascend to God's presence. So Jesus brings it down. He tabernacles among men and dwells in the mess that we had created. And in an even greater miracle than we saw today, Mary's womb becomes pregnant with new life and carries in it the Savior of the world. And as Jesus grows and begins his ministry, he acts as the better Abraham, the true healer, who not only heals the sick and raises the dead, but actually forgives sin. No one can do this but God alone. Abraham prayed for healing, but he was the cause of the disease. Jesus never is. He is waging war against sin with every act of healing that he does. And better than Abimelech, he is the truly innocent king. who willingly gets caught up in the mess of our sin, even when it leads him all the way to death on a cross, where he will bear in his body the full wrath of God against the destructive nature of sin. We're told that he literally becomes our sin so that we might literally become his righteousness. And just like we read the story of Abimelech and say, why is he the one covering shame at great cost to himself? We read the story of the cross and say, why is Jesus the one who bears the brunt of our sin and shame? But on the third day, he rises from the grave. And what that's showing us is that he actually has power over sin. And I need to hear this and you need to hear this, that Jesus is greater than any cycle of sin you might find yourself caught up in. No matter how many times you've been there over and over and over and you wonder if there's hope, Jesus is better. And the cross and resurrection prove this. And he invites everyone who trusts in his life, death, burial, and resurrection to go with him to God's presence. Through belief in the gospel, that's the invitation. What do I do? What do I got to do? That's the question we always want to ask. Stop trying and believe in his work. He's already done it. And when we do, we become made new creatures and we actually can stand before God, just like Abimelech in the dream, and say, I have clean hands and a pure heart. And because we are radically covered in the righteousness of Christ, that is all that the Father sees. He has removed our shame. His eyes are covered from our sin, and he restores our dignity. And he not only deals with the shame, but he deals with the root of it, which is our sin that comes attached with it. Our sin is gone as far as the east is from the west. Even as I say that sometimes, we're like, are you sure? There's no way. It's too good to be true. It is, but it is true. And when we begin to believe this, when it sinks into our bones and we receive the invitation, we can actually have transformation by the power of the Spirit. Just like God has power to open wombs and bring new life, he has the power to make you into a new creation. He has done it in the gospel, and he will continue to do it because through ongoing cycles of human failure, God has proven that he will protect both his promises and his people. And if the story teaches us anything, it is that God is greater than all of your sin and all of its effects. And not only that, but somehow he even uses our sin to bring about greater glory in the end. And I don't understand how that all that works. But where sin abounds, grace does all the more. And I've seen this, church. I've watched it in many of your lives. Many of you have seen it in my own. God can actually take broken things and make them new. He can take the ashes that lay on the ground, whether it's our dreams or physical death or relationships that have broken, and from those ashes, somehow he can form beautiful things. He takes mourning and darkness and brings hope and light. He transforms our hanging heads and drooping shoulders of shame into lifted faces of smiling and dancing and raised eyes before God, confident not on our own merit, but we come boldly to the throne on the merit of Christ alone. And it might be an absolute mess. It might seem like it did on Saturday, that there's no way resurrection could happen as Jesus lays dead in the grave, but that is when God does his best work. So don't give up hope. He'll complete the work he started. And in the end, by grace alone, we'll stand before him with clear eyes, pure hearts, and clean hands, singing, "Worthy is the Lamb who was slain to redeem us from our sin."